What? It's good to know all this high-tech stuff's working so well. Hmm? Don't go away. Enjoy yourselves. Just relax. I'm not going anywhere. Is this like at 1? Is somebody else going to be in here? Oh, okay. Okay. So, no, 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 no. I just, we're not going to, this is like 45, 50 minutes. Not to worry. Okay. Well, I'm not going to rush.
Okay.
Oh. Oh, really? Oh. So I'm being TiVoed? Good. That's cool. I like that. They can skip the commercials, right? Yeah. It's like real life. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, people in Eugene. It's it's like entertainment tonight, you know. We're here in Los Angeles. You folks in New York, it's 3 hours later. You can go to sleep, whatever. Sorry. Okay. All right. The last little, as Liska mentioned, I just gave a talk to the class, whatever the name of the class is. I forgot the name, but the Machine in the Garden interdisciplinary crossover class on certain ideas about the garden. And then what I want to talk about now is, as Liska mentioned, is another central notion of gardens, and this is material from the book, that the cover of which you're looking at here. The book is entitled Defiant Gardens, Making Gardens in Wartime. So this is a bit more formal than what we were just doing. I will, in fact, tell you what any of these images are. If at any point you want to know more about any of them, just kind of speak up, or after we can talk about them as well. Okay. So the year was 1918, which was the 4th year of what was then known as the Great War, which is the First World War. In 1918, the British poet Siegfried Sassoon, who was one of the great British poets of the First World War, was a very courageous soldier, wounded in fact, but at that point had turned against the war, and he interviewed Winston Churchill, who was the Minister of Munitions at the time. And in the course of that interview, Churchill said to Sassoon, he said, "War is the normal occupation of man." Well, as you can imagine, Sassoon wasn't particularly happy with that kind of observation, so he went back to Churchill, and then Churchill added a remarkable caveat, and he said, "War and gardening, both is the normal occupation of man." And you can think of that as the classic dichotomy of the poles of human experience, the poles of destruction and violence versus creation and tranquility. The picture you're looking at here is a garden, a kitchen garden, created in a bomb crater in front of Westminster Cathedral during the Blitz in London during World War II. War is certainly the most extreme of human and environmental conditions. So what does it mean that during wartime one can find gardens? Gardens created during war are one example of what I've termed defiant gardens. Gardens in deserts, in prisons, in hospitals, highway medians, vacant lots, refugee camps, rooftops, dumps, wastelands, even the cracks in the sidewalk. These are all defiant gardens. And what do I mean by that? I mean gardens created in extreme or difficult environmental, cultural, psychological, or social conditions. They all represent acts of adaptation to challenging circumstances and environments, but you can look at them in other ways, as acts of affirmation and human resilience and even resistance. The garden you see here is in a refugee camp in contemporary Chechnya. Typically, in the popular imagination, when people talk about gardens, we think of them as a place of repose, a respite from the city and culture and civilization, where the garden represents the out of doors, the world of nature, and the world that's not human. They're desired, but we rarely think of gardens as essential. My premise was that similar to the way that psychologists and philosophers and theologians have looked at people in extreme circumstances, and maybe that tells us something about the essence of the human condition and what it is to be a human being, that if I looked at gardens in extreme circumstances, it might tell me something about the essence of what gardens mean to people. And my kind of key focus was on garden meaning. So I decided to focus on gardens in the most extreme of circumstances, which are gardens in wartime. Gardens are always, I mentioned this earlier, last hour, gardens are always defined by their context. So perhaps the more extreme the context, or more dramatic the context, the more dramatic and accentuated the meaning. In a remarkable book called Children and Play During the Holocaust by a man named George Eisen, he looked at play during that circumstance during the Second World War. And I think there's some instructive parallels between the garden and play. The fact play is something we often don't take seriously, because pleasure, joy, and abandon, and children and freedom are associated with it, disguises more profound facts about play. Gardens are often seen as just a luxury or a frill or a leisure time pursuit, and not as a basic component of human existence. Ironically, and I think this is important, the beauty of the garden may mask its deeper and more profound messages. When Eisen examined children's play in ghettos and concentration camps and hiding places during World War II, he came to the conclusion that play was, quote in his terms, an enterprise of survival, a defense of sanity, and a demonstration of psychological defiance. Well, so too the garden. These soldiers are harvesting grain here in front of this cannon. This is in World War I. Gardens offer the promise of beauty where there is none, hope instead of despair, optimism versus pessimism, finally life in the face of death. If the Edenic ideal of paradise that we were talking about in the last hour is at one extreme, its opposite is found in the landscape of hell. So maybe the garden is at its highest pitch, perhaps its highest when hell is near. This is Thomas Cole, great 19th century American landscape painter, painting of the expulsion from Eden. Defiance, though, can also be versus extreme environmental conditions, the extremes of climate, topography, lack of soil, water, or even plants. An image I just showed earlier of a garden in the Sahara. So gardens are concentration of meaning, so we might discover more about their meaning by looking at gardens in war. The terrain of war is the battlefield. In a sense, one can think of the battlefield is the antithesis of a garden, a dystopic landscape. Dystopia is the opposite of utopia, which offers no cover or pleasure, but is laden with terror or death. A garden doesn't belong in a battlefield. War is unfamiliar, unimaginable, insane, and appalling. Gardens are the opposite. They're familiar, comprehensible, sane, and pleasing. But a garden can act as an escape, or it can be thought of as a form of counterattack. It can be a line of defense. It can be aggressive. The Scottish artist, poet, and garden designer Ian Hamilton Finlay has said about gardens, he says, certain gardens are described as retreats when they are really attacks. So what are the implications of Churchill's statement about war and gardening? There are many kinds of defiant gardens. As I said, I chose to look at 4 types of gardens, 4 examples related to wars in the 20th century. They included gardens built behind the trenches on the Western Front in the First World War, gardens built in the ghettos under the Nazis during World War II, gardens built by prisoners of war and civilian internees in both world wars, and gardens built by Japanese Americans interned in this country during World War II. Okay? Gardens, as I said, are inseparable from their context. So I'll briefly describe a bit of the history, the context of each of these, and then a few examples in each of these circumstances. There's many more, of course, in the book. Importantly, the evidence, everything I'm going to show you, everything I'm going to tell you, is based entirely on first-person accounts. It's something from a memoir or a diary or someone I interviewed or someone who directly encountered these places and experienced them. These are all defiant gardens. In the trenches, in the ghettos, in the camps, perhaps gardens were an attempt to do something and make something normal in the midst of madness. In other words, to make order out of chaos, or in Eisenman's terms, again, they were an enterprise of survival, a defense of sanity, and a demonstration of psychological defiance. Many years ago, I discovered this remarkable stereo photograph, which was actually the beginnings of this kind of research. And it shows here shelters with gardens behind. You see these few soldiers standing there. They are mud dugouts where they're living, the trees behind them along the kind of line of the front, and then these small little gardens. Well, these gardens were built within the kind of unimaginable world of trench warfare of the First World War. The fact that any gardens were created here at all is rather remarkable and amazing. And you're looking here at an aerial photo of the trenches, the zigzag lines of the trenches, the opposing forces. The big dark arc is no man's land that separated the opposing forces. That to understand the gardens of the First World War, it's necessary to come to grips with a landscape that is almost incomprehensible, a place of horror that had the look and feel of hell. This is the battlefield of the Somme, the scene of some of the most horrific fighting, not just in the First World War, but in human history. This was a landscape devoid of life, a battlefield terrain transformed by the modern technology of war. It was a ruptured earth, a defoliated landscape, a place that contained the sights, the sounds, and the smell of death. It was essentially a kind of Frankenstein fabrication, something that we had created. A painting by Paul Nash, who was a British wartime painter of no man's land. Okay. In a supreme irony, the most prosaic and ordinary of landscapes, a garden you would not expect to find, but in fact they were created. So here's a soldier from London, 1914, standing outside of his dugout in sandbags. You see the blasted trees behind him and this small little vegetable garden in front of him. Or in the same, this is images here from the Illustrated London News, which was kind of like a life magazine of the period, showing the title of this was A Villa Garden on Regent Street. The soldiers would name the trenches after street names in London and other cities. The same newspaper carried a little while later another image here called a trench garden, but one that was clearly more propagandistic, because you see the soldier in the foreground is planting bulbs. Everyone is very nicely dressed. One guy's even holding up a puppy. And then it's bower of trees in the spring. It was not like that at all. They even carried images of gardens on the other side, here showing landscape gardening in the German lines. And this was in an English paper. Okay? At the camps behind the lines, it was commonplace for camps to create insignias of regiments and units using whatever materials were available. So here, this elaborate parterre being constructed. You see, I love the kind of officers' overseeing the enlisted men here. There were even competitions for the best gardens. Farther behind the lines, okay, battlefields merged with the surrounding countryside. And even while the war was still on, this land was being reclaimed. So this soldier planting these vegetables in this trench, again being overseen by this officer, the war is still on. The front is just several miles away. A garden could be the combination of the task for the moment and a hope for the future. What we often think of as leisure in peacetime, or just killing time in peacetime, in war could be a profound respite. So 2 Australian soldiers here in a field of wildflowers. The image you're looking at here is a garden in the prison of the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay. In the spring of 1942, a few children in the Lodz Ghetto, which was the second largest ghetto in Poland after Warsaw, had constructed a garden in this kind of forlorn piece of ground. And Sylvia Wehner, who was her teacher, tells in her memoir that when the children of the ghetto were to be deported, in fact, deported to their extermination, they went into the garden and pulled up everything that was growing and stamped on the earth, and they said, nothing will grow after we're gone, nothing will bloom in the garden. In deliberate defiance, they had stamped out what was growing there. They felt the earth had betrayed them, but in deliberate defiance, they had stamped out what they intuitively, as children, understood what the garden represented, which was hope and life. Gardens in the ghetto. It seems a preposterous but amazing proposition, but there were gardens in the major ghettos of Eastern Europe. Gardens like any other aspect of life that we might consider normal. Going to school, going to the park, having enough for dinner, were in fact possible in the ghettos, but only through extraordinary human effort. The life of the ghetto gardens, like those who were imprisoned in the ghetto, were short-lived. But during their brief existence, gardens were attempts to create conditions for survival. They were mechanisms of resistance to the horrific conditions under which people were forced to live. They offered work and relief and solace. They were acts of hope and defiance. The Nazis invaded Poland in September 1939, and they established the ghetto in Warsaw a year later. What you're looking at here is a map of the ghetto. The dark blue line and the dashed line was the entire ghetto. The southern portion was ultimately cut off, and then the whole area gradually constricted. But eventually, almost 500,000 people were living in an area, living isn't really the right word, were contained within an area of less than 1,000 acres. Warsaw at the time was the largest Jewish city in Poland, with about 250,000 Jews, about a third of the city's population. In this place, and I'll spare you the images, people were falling dead in the middle of the street. They were being systematically starved to death. But there was, in parallel to this, there was a life that existed parallel to this. There was the long Eastern European Jewish tradition of communities, self-help, and organization. There was both pragmatic and altruistic. So in the ghetto, there were organizations that responded to the basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter, but also organizations that were directed towards education, the arts, and culture. And if you think of it, the garden is one of those rare elements in society that responds to things we think of as our basic needs and things that we think of as our higher needs. Okay? There were organizations whose activities were directed towards saving the community and resistance to German policies. One such organization was the Parole, which was the Polish acronym for the Society to Encourage Agriculture in the Jewish Community, that had been founded in the early 1930s to train agricultural workers. This is the vegetable garden in the orphanage of the Warsaw Ghetto. This is a group of these individuals in 1938, before the war, standing proudly in front of their produce. This group, the Parole in the ghetto, acquired land and seeds. They raised funds, they mobilized and trained workers, and they built gardens. They even built glass houses as best they could, greenhouses. And they even organized themselves. They had bylaws. And this is from their bylaws, which I discovered. You have to realize this was written in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. Okay? They wrote the following: we are to instill in the children an aesthetic appreciation of their surroundings, direct their attention to growing plants that might bring them closer to nature and provide them with aesthetic experiences. It's in the middle, 1942. It's important to note that however impressive their activities, like virtually all ghetto actions of resistance and survival, the efforts were valiant, the results were meager, but the gardens are nonetheless inspiring. You'd expect, of course, people to plant vegetables. They were being starved to death, but Parole also planted flowers in over 200 courtyards in the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay. In the Lodz Ghetto, a man named Oscar Singer, who was a historian, spoke about the fact that virtually any vacant area had been planted with vegetables, but the fact that anybody from the outside wouldn't have any understanding of the kind of effort it undertook to do the most basic garden activities. And he describes that having a watering can was essentially virtually a luxury item. By the way, the images here are not any of the people whose names I'm saying here in the ghetto, but they are the places, the same exact places that I'm talking about. In the Lodz Ghetto, the boundary of the ghetto was drawn and then the wall created around a semi-rural area that was then divided amongst people by lot. And in this area, a man named Roman Kent was about 16 at the time. He and his brother had a garden, and he describes the fact in 1944, this was the kind of last surviving ghetto, that starvation was so rampant in the ghetto that people just went into the fields and the gardens and they pulled up everything that was growing so they'd have something to eat. And he described to me, I interviewed him, standing there just crying for just the loss of their produce, but also the realization if people could wait another day or another week, literally there would be more food for them. Still, he described the gardens as a lifeline to life for he and his family. When, it obviously says, kind of Jews are forbidden to use the park. Okay? When the Nazis took power in Germany, their persecution of Jews pervaded all aspects of life. Even before restricting habitation to the ghetto, Jews were forbidden to use parks and public open spaces. And given the horrific conditions of the ghettos of Eastern Europe, the loss of a garden or a park might be seen as a luxury. But the desire for some contact with the natural world and the quest for some semblance or restoration of normalcy represented in a park was critical. Okay. The boundaries of the Warsaw Ghetto that I showed you earlier were deliberately drawn to exclude two adjacent parks. I interviewed a man named Jan Jagielski, who's the photo archivist of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and he said that people had fantasy gardens. Well, what did he mean by that? People would climb to the upper stories and roof of buildings along the wall that overlooked these gardens, that overlooked that green space, and imagine the life they had before the war and the one they wished for but didn't have kind of after the war. Okay? The Warsaw Ghetto was destroyed after the uprising in the spring of 1943, completely obliterated. You see the blasted tree on the right. That is in one of those gardens. The wall went just to the left of this. There was heroic and active resistance to the Nazis, most notably in that uprising, but there were also innumerable acts of what has been termed spiritual resistance. You're looking here at the staff of the garden in the Lodz Ghetto's hospital, and those are largely doctors that you see there. The slogan of Jewish communal activity in Warsaw was, live in dignity and die in dignity. Well, how does one remain fully human? How do you sustain your dignity? Well, one way is through cultural continuity, the habits and practices that have served you well. Garden making was only one of such practices. It could be psychological protection from harmful forces, also a way to preserve one's life and dignity. We use the term morale most often in association with soldiers, but the prisoners of the ghetto were essentially civilian combatants in the war. The garden was one thing that could be good for morale. Okay? What is heroic? This is in that same garden, a scarecrow complete with a yellow star. What is heroic? Actions that transcend the normal range, that confound our expectations, that take courage, where people overcome danger and fear. These were heroic gardens and gardeners. The drawing you're looking at here was done by a German soldier captured by the Americans at the Battle of the Bulge at the end of World War II and imprisoned in an American POW camp in France. And you see the garden in the foreground. Armies have always taken prisoners. They capture both soldiers and civilians. And prisoner of war camps, and which we unfortunately know too well in kind of contemporary history, are typically miserable places where people suffer physical and psychological privation. There's the trauma of being imprisoned, of being bored, depressed, and complete loss of contact with the outside world. This is in the Changi prison camp in Singapore. The painting is by Murray Griffin, a famous Australian painter who was imprisoned there during the war. For prisoners, combat is over, but a war continues against disease and boredom and their condition. The term barbed wire disease was coined in the First World War to describe the psychological condition that afflicted POWs. But people found and find ways to adapt to those circumstances, maintain their sanity, and some even to get something positive from the experience. Perhaps the First World War's most stunning example of a social organization of prisoners was a camp called Ruhleben, which was a converted racetrack outside of Berlin, where about 7,000 British civilians were interred during World War I. And they proceeded to take this camp and transform it themselves. This was an area they described as Trafalgar Square. In this place, they organized formal and informal educational and cultural networks. This is from the frontispiece of the camp newspaper that they published. And they organized themselves in terms of gardening. They took the central race area of this racetrack, converted it into a kind of large pond, and then elaborate vegetable garden. They formed a garden club. They formed a chapter of the Royal Horticultural Society. And ultimately, there were 3,000 members of a garden club for which they paid dues amongst these 7,000 men. And they even had garden competitions for the best flowers, the best barracks gardens, and my favorite is the best boutonniere. See, nobody here knows what a boutonniere is? I knew that. Okay, boutonniere is when you stick a flower in your little lapel. When you talk to older audiences, they laugh at that. Okay. Or here, this is the garden journal of Colonel C.I. Rolfe, who was imprisoned in Stalag Luft III for 5 years during the Second World War. That's a plan of the garden that he created at this POW camp, and this is part of his journal. Stalag Luft III was perhaps the most famous or infamous camp in Europe. It was the site from which the Great Escape was attempted, which some of you know, at least from the movie with Steve McQueen. Last year, I was giving this talk at the North Carolina Arboretum, and I met a man named Dr. John Creech. Dr. Creech is a rather famous, he's about 90 now, famous horticulturalist. At one time was the director of the National Arboretum. And he told me his story, which was that in World War II, he was an American soldier in North Africa. He was captured in North Africa, taken to a POW camp in Germany, and then another POW camp in Poland. At this camp in Poland, there was a derelict greenhouse. And he convinced the authorities to allow him to refurbish the greenhouse. He got seeds from the Red Cross. And for this activity, he says he thinks he's pretty sure he's the only American soldier. He won the Bronze Star for gardening. Okay? And he gave me a copy of the certificate. Immediately after the war, he wrote about this in an article entitled "I Gardened for My Life." This was in Better Homes and Gardens in 1946. Okay. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. And this is a history that I'm sure and certainly hope that everyone here in Oregon is familiar with, but it allowed and fostered the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans in a series of camps, largely in the American West and the two in Arkansas for most of the duration of World War II. If you lived west of that dark line in Washington, Oregon, California, or Arizona, you were interred in one of those camps. The large triangles you see there, the others were the kind of intermediary way stations that people were interned at. Ironically or oddly or bizarrely, if you lived east of that line, you were not interred. If you lived in Chicago or New York, you were not sent into a camp. The Japanese American population was rounded up and temporarily housed in a series of assembly centers. This is a drawing by a woman named Minnie Akubo, who was a graduate student in fine arts in Berkeley at the time. She was expelled from the university, as same thing happened in Oregon, etc. And they were individuals who temporarily housed in a racetrack south of San Francisco. But if you look close, you can see immediately individuals began to create gardens. But the camps were largely located in remote sites in the American West, largely desert climates, places that were horribly cold in the wintertime, horribly hot in the summertime, incredibly difficult places. This is the plant of Manzanar, perhaps the best known but not largest camp, on the east side of the Sierras, west of Death Valley in California. Each of those little rectangles was a barracks. Ultimately, this camp held about 10,000 people, men, women, and children. But within this place, those who were interned there created gardens and transformed the landscape of this camp. The National Park Service has done an archaeological survey of Manzanar, which is now a National Historic Site, and when they did that, they discovered that there were gardens everywhere. In front of every barracks, in front of every mess hall, in front of the judo hall, the temple, the church, the ball fields, victory gardens between things. So here is one of these gardens in front of one of the mess halls, and this is, in fact, a part of their archaeological survey. This kind of very elaborate stone and water garden at Manzanar, of which there's many, many. Okay, Manzanar, and at a certain point, individuals were allowed outside of the camps and use the surrounding environment essentially as a nursery, gathering plants here, full-grown trees. This is in kind of Arizona, as well as particularly stones and rocks, as we'll see. Manzanar, though, was a home to a large group of professional gardeners. And there's a history, which I suspect many of you are not familiar with, but before World War II, the Japanese-American and Japanese-Canadian community, for that matter, were the mainstay of the garden design and garden maintenance professions on the West Coast. In Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA, San Diego. And so you had people who were incredibly skilled and sophisticated in their design and construction abilities. Okay? An example of that, this was one garden to construct anything, and this was done with, obviously, with the permission of the authorities. To construct anything, they were only allowed 3 sacks of cement on any project. So they got the papers and they got 3 sacks of cement. Then somebody forged more papers and got 3 more sacks of cement. They kept doing this. Ultimately, they had 24 sacks of cement to create this incredibly elaborate stone and water wheel garden and wishing well, a whole bunch of things here. And ultimately, within the camp, this became known, ironically, as the 3-sack pond. It's a kind of little in-joke. At Manzanar, the site that was most photographed by visitors, who included the photographers Dorothea Lange, Ansel Adams, who wrote a book against the camps and his photographs during the war, as well as a man named Toyo Miyataki, who was camp photographer inside the camp, but no one else was allowed, in fact, to have a camera, was this, which was Merritt Park, this elaborate stone and water, really Japanese stroll garden designed by the Nishi brothers, who were at the center of this photograph. Garden making in the camps was a way of domesticating an inhospitable environment. This was a place that was home, but for an indeterminate length of time. Gardens offered the dignity of work and an expression of individual and collective creativity. They were a kind of anti-camp. This is the Soul lawnmower, literally, at Manzanar. They were a kind of anti-camp, a subversive response to the internment that people were subjected to. These are great American gardens. Well, all of the gardens I've shown you were short-lived. And if I got a lesson out of any of this research, it was the significance of a garden is not proportional to its size or how long it lasts. So that a flower pot can mean as much to people as acres and acres of gardens, and something that you've just glimpsed at and just looked can mean as much to someone, a garden that someone has experienced their entire life. Okay? They're not proportional to their meaning. In fact, here I think the brief lifespan of some of these gardens probably accentuates their meaning. This is a 1917 photograph entitled "Where Pastoral Peace Once More Reigns in a Fiercely Contested Battlefield." So one can ask what happened to each of these places. In Warsaw, visiting the Warsaw Ghetto, as I mentioned earlier, the ghetto was completely obliterated in 1943. What you see there now is essentially Soviet block housing, and then any trees, of course, have grown up since the war. In visiting there, I knew that I was not going to find any kind of remnants of gardens at all, but I knew that this was a place, this actual place, where families were rounded up, where people were slaughtered, and that the unthinkable happened. And that on this ground, that a few people had grown food and planted seeds and to try and keep their hopes alive. This site, this street corner, and that site, the exact site, the very exact site where there were gardens in 1942. Okay, this is one of the two remaining walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. In this country, the camps were demolished. Most of the buildings moved. In a few places here, this is a place where the Park Service has excavated one of these gardens. You can wander around this desert landscape and see that. Nature always returns and eventually obscures the evidence of human action, even of the most horrific kind. It may be rapid, over a season, or over generations, but eventually culture becomes compost. Okay. These Defiant Gardens might seem out of place, but paradoxically, I think these gardens reveal themselves to be supremely adapted to their condition. And they astonish us, and I find them, frankly, kind of inspiring. All gardens embody a paradox. We associate gardens with the natural world, but in fact, gardens are a prime example of our dominion, our control over the natural world, a manifestation of our ability to be in control. And perhaps during wartime or periods of extreme stress, the gardens are potent reminders of the ability to be in control and not yield to forces of chaos. Well, the meanings and the associations of these gardens, I think, are many, but I came to the conclusion that these gardens are about, and I think all gardens, are about 5 deceptively simple themes. Gardens are about life, home, hope, work, and beauty. Gardens are alive. They're places of a connection to home. They embody hope. They're places of work, and they're sites of artistry. Those are all commonplace themes, but the meaning of them is accentuated in these extreme circumstances. One way I like to think about gardens is a lot of us will have a friend or a relative who is nice and they're fun to be around and they're congenial companions. And then in a moment of kind of stress or need, they respond with kind of unexpected compassion and help and aid. And I think gardens are like that. Gardens are there and they're nice and but they have a capacity, really dormant capacities, that can arise in conditions of extreme stress that can activate, if you will, their potential. So let me kind of briefly go through those 5 elements. You have life. Nature is alive, and we are connected and identify with its vitality. We have an innate affinity for the natural world, both plant and animal life, what E.O. Wilson, sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, calls biophilia. Okay? During wartime, where death is omnipresent and fragile, perhaps that connection to life forces is even more critical. Warsaw native George Topas described a circumstance in Warsaw where literally on this side, tomatoes were being planted, and on this side, mass graves were being created. And the contrast. This is actually the exact place of that. So what happens when nature is systematically excluded from one's life? You're looking here at a drawing by a New Zealand soldier imprisoned in Poland during World War II, and his little poem and drawing here, Haven. You see this bungalow, and it's an image here of home. We have deep attachments, of course, to the places we call home, and a garden can represent both our home, and it can also be a mnemonic device that connects us to homes that we've had, to associations that we've had with homes. Gardens are a form of domesticating space. This is at Manzanar. So Japanese Americans, in turn there, took what was a vacant canvas and they made it into their home. Garden making was a way of taking possession through their design, something particularly dramatic for people who'd just been dispossessed. In all the camps in this country, all official correspondence and talking and meetings, publications had to be in English. In a sense, garden making was a way of speaking one's native tongue, of making this place Japanese. This is the Minidoka camp in Idaho. You see the camp, you see a Torah gate there, and an area which they call the Wildlife Preserve just outside the camp. In this camp, if you look close, a Mr. Nita bonsaied the sagebrush, okay, which is kind of here. You know, He kind of transformed it, made it into a garden, and essentially made it Japanese. Minidoka, in fact, had many skilled designers, but the story of the Kogita garden is perhaps most dramatic. Mr. Kogita, who's the individual there on the far left, was from Seattle. At his home in Seattle, he had a very elaborate garden. In the camp, he built another kind of elaborate, in camp, he built another elaborate garden, including acquiring a 1-ton rock that became part of this, and the garden helped him. His children, who were young at the time, said it helped him survive the experience. Ironically, when people were sent to camps, they had between 3 and 6 days to gather all their belongings, and they were allowed a single suitcase, each person. Okay. When they left, the government, oddly, sent them back home and paid to send them back home with their belongings. Mr. Kogita had the government send back his garden. He had the stones wrapped and sent back, and he reconstructed the garden, or elements of it, at his place, at his home in Seattle. After he died, the stones went to his sons, if you see here, who were children at the time, and they now sit there as family heirlooms. So we make home, or we make reminders of it. This is a Senor Luis Medina, Antonio Medina, in a squatter settlement outside of Bogota. And the garden that he was creating on his rooftop here was a reminder of his garden in the rural village that he came from before he was dispossessed by the violence in the countryside in Colombia. Or here, Italian soldiers, POWs in World War II, of course, at a POW camp in Australia, they created a model of the Colosseum. Okay? Or here, images, these were given to me. This was during the first Gulf War at an American base in Saudi Arabia, 500 tents, 10 persons per tent. In front of every tent within 2 weeks, I was told, in front of everyone was something you might describe as a garden or a yard, using whatever materials were available, a way of trying to make this into one's temporary home. Okay. Gardens take time to conceive and make and develop and grow. And since time immemorial, cultures have wondered it. You take a seed, you put it into the dark ground, and it emerges out into the life, to the light and life. And hope is embodied in that transition. What's the tree, folks? What? Right, Ailanthus altissima, the tree of heaven, or the tree that grew in Brooklyn. Okay. Soldiers, of course, hope to be not to be mortally wounded. They hope to survive. They hope for peace. And their primal fear is a fear of death and returning to the earth. A garden or any sign of life is a sign of regeneration, of life emerging. Several years ago in researching this, I interviewed a woman named Esther Mishkin, who her father had a garden in the Warsaw Ghetto. This is not her father, but this is the Warsaw Ghetto. And she said that, I asked her, did you work in the garden? And she said, no, it was really my father's. And then she described sitting there, watching her father look at the garden. And she said about this, he used to just like to sit there and just watch it grow. And she said, she said about that, she said, it gave him the feeling that something is growing, that we could survive somehow. A wish that was fulfilled only for his daughter. There's a distinction between a garden as a refuge and a garden as a respite. A refuge is a true sanctuary. A respite is just a kind of temporary calm or alleviating a condition. In the ghettos, the gardens were just respite. But that doesn't lessen the significance of that situation. Nelson Mandela, in his autobiography, describes the garden he created on Robben Island during his long years of imprisonment, and he's very specific about what it meant to him. He writes the following. He says, the garden was one of the few things in prison that one could control. To plant a seed, watch it grow, tend it, harvest it, offered a simple but enduring satisfaction. The sense of being the custodian of this small patch of earth offered a small taste of freedom. Well, garden, as I mentioned earlier to this group, is a verb as well as a noun. And defiant gardens are acts of defiant gardening. They emphasize work and the multiple meanings of work. Work is productive, but it's also a way to keep your mind and body busy. It's something to do. It offers dignity and self-respect and identity. Mrs. Arima here at the relocation camp in Arkansas and her garden. Or here, a group captain G.D.H. Ross from his journal as a prisoner of the Japanese in Indonesia during World War II. Or here, imprisoned at the Poston camp in the Southwest, Mr. Inoue said about this amazing garden. He said about hard work in this garden. He says, well, we were Japanese after all, so no one spent lazy days. Has anyone seen the film Green Fingers? You can rent it, and it's periodically on TV. The film, it's actually Helen Mirren's in it, and Clive Owen, and a bunch of other folks. It tells a story. It's a fictional story, but it's based on real events. The events are an experimental garden program in a prison in Britain, where individuals are learning gardening for rehabilitation and hopefully something they could do when they get out. These hardened criminals do this. They get engaged in this. They get so excited about it, they want to enter their garden in the Chelsea Flower Show. They enter the garden in the Chelsea Flower Show. They win a prize. They meet the Queen. Okay? All true. Okay? And they continue to do that. This is their 2004 entry, and you see this derelict landscape being transformed, and they titled this one A Garden of Hope. In the movie, there's also a love story. Not true. Okay. It's like, I found out the real story. Not true. No love story. But the Queen, same Queen. Okay. Gardens are beautiful. So in war, the antithesis of the beautiful, the garden may become the highest art. There's this French soldier here with his trowel making these beautiful arcs, which are the same arc as his mustache. Okay? Behind the lines in World War I was the exceptional garden of the Talbot or Tock House, which is the white building at the center, which functioned essentially like for British soldiers, like a USO would for American soldiers. When you entered this garden, you passed through the building, and on the sign on the back door, there was a sign, and the sign is still there. They've restored this garden saying, "Come into the garden and forget about the war." Okay. A woman named Gerda Klein was 18 in 1942 and then spent the next 3 years being shuttled from concentration camps to slave labor camps. And she describes the last camp she was in. Every morning, 2,000 young women were marched from their barracks to a factory where they were working. And they were marched by the commandant's house or place where there was a rose garden. And she and others just had the desire to go and smell something or touch or even look more carefully at the roses, knowing if they stepped out of line, they would have been shot. One morning, she describes that a crocus had broken through the concrete, and the 2,000 women kind of walked like that around it silently, so not as to stamp out the crocus and the life that was growing there. Okay? Art, in all its forms, visual, musical, literary, is not a luxury or a frill, but an imperative and perhaps even a necessity. Okay. Well, lastly, as we unfortunately know too well, as I'm talking and we're sitting here, war is raging in different parts of the world, and gardens are being created. So 3 final examples from 3 wars. I received this photograph and a letter from Mr. Bill Beardall, who now lives in North Carolina. This was after my book was published. But in 1970, he was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. And he created this garden. The garden here is just that little space that he's standing in front of. Okay? But he wrote about this. He said, this garden, he said, it had a calming effect on me. After long days of flying missions in the I-Corps area to see a little bit of green growing by my doorway. He added, as small as it was my oasis. Many a day or late evening, I'd sit in my, quote, patio, drink a, quote, cocktail, and enjoy the setting sun in the west. I could almost block out the medevac choppers going out and the sound of artillery in the distance. I've never forgotten much from that war, and never my oasis. Or this image, which some of you may have seen, it was in the Register Guard, the Oregonian as well. It's from 2004, and it's from Iraq, north of Baghdad, and it shows Warrant Officer Brooke Turner, who was actually a native of Oregon but stationed in Hawaii before the war. And you see here, excuse me, tending his little garden patch. He said about this, he said, usually after work, and he was referring to work stateside, not work in Iraq. He says, usually after work, I'll water the backyard and listen to the radio barefoot and just relax and feel the cool grass. I thought if I planted some grass, I could still do that in a silly sort of way. So he got grass seed from home, tried to grow it, it failed, and then somehow he acquired sod. This is, to me, one of the great mysteries. How this guy got sod in Iraq, I don't know. Okay? We couldn't get proper armaments and proper protection for soldiers. This guy got sod. Clearly the wrong people were in charge, but we know that already. Okay. Okay. And you see him here trimming the grass with scissors, giving this lawn here the same brush cut that's on his head. Okay. You're looking here also in Iraq, sergeants, this is Sergeant Justin Wanzak and Sergeant Carl Quam. They're of the 141st Engineer Combat Battalion of the North Dakota National Guard. And actually, I was speaking about this several weeks ago in North Dakota, in Fargo, and I took great pleasure in kind of saying their names. And when I said National Guard, everybody, clapped and cheered because North Dakota doesn't get mentioned that often outside of North Dakota. Okay. Anyway, they said about the gardens they were created. Here too, they said, and they're farmers stateside, said, we were missing home farming and the joy of growing something. So they too got seeds donated from home, tried to grow things, failed. They got advice from local Iraqi gardeners, and they grew what you see there. And then they engaged in what Sergeant Quam described as garden time. And he said it was time in the evening, returning from perilous combat patrol missions, temperatures 140 degrees. He said it was good therapy to relax after a day of dodging roadside bombs. It was a release, a time to put our minds off what was happening. For a little time in the evening, things seem right, things seem real. And lastly, Sarajevo was a city that was once renowned for the peaceful relationships amongst its various ethnic and religious communities. But between 1992 and 1995, 10,000 Sarajevans were killed and about 50,000 wounded. In 2000, the American Friends Service Committee established a community garden program in Bosnia and Herzegovina, directed by a man named Dvorin, who's the guy in the striped shirt that you see there. To work in these gardens, you have to meet two conditions. The first condition is you have to be poor. You have to be poor enough that you need the produce of the garden for your own sustenance, and maybe you can grow a little more that you can sell in the marketplace. Secondly, though, each of these community gardens has to have a multi-ethnic constituency of Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians. So the garden is a project in reconciliation. Okay. During the 1930s in Western Europe, there was a Congress, the International Congress of Modern Architects, which was the founding collaborative of modern architects in Europe, had a saying. And their saying was, how can one think about roses when the forests are burning? In other words, how can one think about something positive and good and beautiful? This is in the 30s, the rise of fascism in Europe. How can one think about doing something like that when the world is falling apart around you? They then answered their own question. And their answers was, how can you not plant roses when the forests are burning? Because the forests are always burning, and we always need to plant roses. Thank you. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, and Eugene, if you're still there. What? Lights or questions or responses or anything? Or some of you have heard that before, or versions of that. Yes, Lyndon.
Before you showed someone in Vietnam, I
Mm-hmm.
was wondering if you were interested in or planning on doing a deeper study on Vietnam, since it is such a prominent war.
When I was just to kind of brief, when I started this research, I started with the First World War. Okay. As I was doing that, a colleague of mine who was doing research actually on the diary of Anne Frank was reading other diaries. And she read one diary which talked about gardens in the Warsaw Ghetto. I read that, and then I started that. Okay. I started a research at the Imperial War Museum in London. And as I'm talking with people in the Imperial War Museum, a woman, a photo archivist, says to me one day, well, have you looked at Ruhleben? Which place I showed, and she talked Ruhleben as like, have you been to Las Vegas? Like everybody knew about it. I said, no. I ended up looking at prisoner of war camps because of that encounter. The Japanese-American experience I knew about and had done some research on, and know the people in the Park Service who'd done that research. At a certain point, I realized I can only, there's sadly enough wars historically and now and sadly in the future to look at. So I limited myself. And then there is a website I've put up, which I don't keep up as much as I should, where I've been adding things like this, from Vietnam, from Guantanamo, from other situations. Um, it's hard to stop. When you get into research, it's hard to stop. The first book I read after I'm done with this is a book about the Gulag in the Soviet Union. And believe it or not, in Siberia, in the Gulag, people had gardens as well. So I'm not going to do more. But if you've come across anything or see anything, give it to me. There's pieces of here that I've added. There's these the Signora Antonio in Bogota was an individual I in touring gardens there last year encountered. Yeah.
In your research, did you find that the gardens evolved?
Like,
You didn't find that warfare evolved? Or did they stay relatively the same? Justin or
I mean, you're talking about gardens that are, as I said earlier, kind of short-lived, and are both for sustenance and beyond. And the line between those is not sharp. And in fact, when you read individuals' accounts and diaries and so on, they'll talk about the gardens, even kind of vegetable gardens, that the most critical thing about them was not the food. It was these other aspects, literally the beauty of it, the work of it, the activity of it was equally, and for many people, much more important than actually the sustenance they may have gotten. That was even true for individuals who were starving, which I think is critical. The evolution depends on the kind of different circumstances. So, for example, I mean, in the First World War in the ghetto, these didn't have time to evolve. To create a garden in any of these situations, the story of the secret garden, it's really, you really can't have a secret garden. It's really hard to have a secret garden. They need territory, they need space, they need material, and so on. So all of these at least needed, if you were imprisoned, the tacit approval of the authorities. So like in the ghettos, there was approval for a certain period, and then they stopped. Then they weren't allowed any longer. At POW camps, it was at the whim of whoever's in charge, from someone who would encourage this to someone who said, no, you can't do this. The only one evolution would be the ones in this country, in the Japanese, in the internment camps in this country, where there is at least 3 years worth of time. These places did in fact evolve and became very elaborate and very kind of dramatic and really kind of great works of artistry. So, and they grew. I mean, literally the trees, things weren't just seasonal. Yeah. Mm. What do you mean by not immediate? No, you have to do it. No. Right.
So there is a sense in which the act of planting a garden is also a recognition that you're going to be there. I'm wondering about, sort of, in particularly, say, for example, the guys in the trenches, some of the other places where I can imagine that being a kind of resignation at the same time that there's such really serious political focus on the protect better stuff. Do you have a notion of sort of like at what moment someone says, okay, I'm going to start planting a garden? It doesn't strike me that that's the day.
No, it's probably not the date. On the Western Front, I mean, in warfare, you can only have a garden if you're going to be stable in a place for a long enough time. Well, when the trenches on the Western Front, within 6 months of the war, became stable and lasted until the end of the war, and the line only kind of moving back and forth. So there were large places and periods where people were just there on both sides. So there was a certain kind of stability, is not quite the right, but there was you were in place for a period of time, hoping that time was going to end pretty soon, like tomorrow, And what I find remarkable is people planting things, hoping they're not going to be there for the harvest. In that circumstance. In the ghettos, you were hoped you would be there for the harvest because the alternative was you were going to be exterminated, which everybody knew. So it depends on the kind of situation. In the internment camps in this country, hopefully we're planting, but hopefully we'll go home soon. So I think gardening is always an optimistic act because when you put a seed in the ground, it's not you want it to come up. And you anticipate that and hope. But it does, each I think are situational. It depends on the circumstance and situation. Now, whether people, you say immediate, do people do it immediately? That also depends on the circumstance. In the internment camps, a very common thing was people took plants with them. I'm coming from LA, and they took a plant. They took seeds with them. Okay, as a kind of reminder of, essentially as a reminder of home, and as something that was cherished. That was in fact very common. There's a lot of accounts describing that. Oddly, you have things like in the Western Front, which we think of as, war is way over there. Well, those lines of those trenches are there, and then there's another line of trenches, then there's another line of trenches. You go back about 10 miles, it's like the Willamette Valley. It's peaceful. There are villages, farms. The war was in that band, and life is back there. So people went from the trenches and then back for the weekend to Paris or Berlin or London, and then back to hell. And they got seeds. I've got letters like, "Dear Mum," these are British soldiers, "please send the following garden books." How's Pa's garden? And they had mail, regular mail at the front, better than our mail actually now. That's true. Yeah. Yeah, no, I purposefully, and there was great research I did talk about cemeteries a bit, because the cemeteries begin at the front and then become institutionalized. They're literally right there. And so, but I was intentionally didn't do the home front. Because the home front is critical and important, but I wanted to focus on the kind of most extreme condition there. And there is a connection and relationship. When you say, and I also only dealt with situations where people had at least some semblance of free will. So obviously, soldiers in the front, they had free will. In the camps in this country, people that was actually encouraged in the ghettos up to a point. I didn't, for example, look at gardens in concentration camps. There were gardens in concentration camps, but those were essentially slave laborers doing the commandant's garden until they were killed, and there was really little, there was no kind of free will in terms of the kind of meaning of that. Their meaning, I think, is something very different. So that was a choice I made. Yeah, Charlotte. Two routes. I took I-5. No. Sorry, I didn't mean to. One is a kind of long interest in landscape history and garden meaning. So that's a kind of deeper kind of question of wanting to know why this kind of very kind of fundamental kind of place is important to people, and not to everybody. That's another thing. There's it's like people who love music and those who can't hear anything. There's some things that matter to some people and others that don't. So that's not meaningful for everyone, but for those who it is meaningful to, it's tremendously powerful. So that was kind of one. The other was literally that photograph, the stereo photograph. I found that picture years ago, and I don't remember where, and I wish I did. I collect stuff, and I had this. You find something and you put it on your shelf. It's a rock or a stone or something, and I had this picture, and it was on my shelf for years, because I knew it was important. It was the two pairs of soldiers in the front and the French gardens behind the front lines in the French trenches. It's a stereo photograph. You look at them with a stereo viewer, and you get 3D view, like if you've done air photo interpretation. Same thing. I had that, and then the lecture I gave you in the first hour, I used to give a version of that. I used to give lectures for the Oregon Committee for Humanities all around the state. And it was some version of that. And then I'd kind of end the talk, say, and then there are these gardens that I don't have a name for, and I didn't have a name. And I showed that, and I'd show other ones in industrial sites and highways and, difficult places. And I started collecting images and articles about those. And then one day, and I, again, don't remember the day, the word defiant clicked as a way to think about that. And then when I wanted to think about it, it was really coupled with that picture that I'm going to look at war, which I've had no, I haven't been in the army, and so on. It wasn't kind of based on my personal experience. Although to do the research, then you have to, I think when you do any kind of research that's, let's say, cross-disciplinary, you're responsible for the other discipline. So the World War I history, the Holocaust history, the Japanese-American history, so I became knowledgeable in. Also had people who were experts in those areas read what I wrote to make sure I wasn't wrong about the facts. The interpretation, I take responsibility for. But it also, how did I come to the top? There's another side to that. I actually did this in order. I looked at the World War I and then the ghettos, and then it was incredibly depressing and incredibly uplifting at the same time. So actually in the middle of it, my wife said, you got to stop for a while. And I actually did. I tried to because you can just read so many accounts of horror, and after a while, it literally was getting to me. It was like, so I stopped for a while and went to Italy, Where, of course, we're traveling in Croatia, and on this one island, it's gorgeous, it's wonderful. You're taking ferries from one place to another, and I'm reading in the guidebook, and it says, during World War II, there was a concentration camp on this island, which, of course, we went to visit, So, it's like, the Italians had concentration camps. Not well known, but they did too. Okay. So, fix the South Waterfront. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And thank you there in Eugene. Okay. Everyone here is having a really nice catered lunch. The carving tables over there, right? Okay. And the vegans, we have little plots for.